Hello and welcome to the Wisden Geopolitics podcast. I'm joined by Cam Ponsonby and Katya Witney. We will get to the ICC's decision to suspend Sri Lanka cricket for governmental interference, which is the big story of the day. But first, let's discuss South Africa's 5-wicket win over Afghanistan. Cam, the moment of the game for me was Asmatullah Omar's side being stranded on 9-7 at the end of that first innings, which was just heartbreaking, wasn't it?
Yeah, I've actually really like milestones, and I like that milestones matter when they kind of shouldn't. I know it's kind of very trendy, especially in the T20 world where players slowing down is like the kind of cardinal sin. But I think it's more often than not, it's done because players are nervous over something mattering to them as much as it is being kind of selfish. And you could see that with Asmatullah in that he's playing this wonderful innings. He's going pretty much a run a ball. He needs kind of a handful of runs off the final over, but he has the confusion of he can't knock one and get Naveen on strike and then potentially get back on strike. And so eventually he just runs out of time, and he's walking off of his highest ever score for his country, having single-handedly basically got them to a competitive total. The next highest score is 26, and he's really sad, which is just doesn't feel right. But all in all, I think it's one of those where as long as he gets 100 at some point in the next year or two, he'll look back on it with a smile on his face. But for now, it's the kind of contradiction of the best day of his batting career for his country, and maybe also the worst. Who knows?
Yeah, it was also just how it happened. Like, you had sort of him getting loads of twos at the end of the 49th over and feeling like, okay, this feels different to how he'd been just like sort of like hitting boundaries pretty freely before then. And then, yeah, the sort of the dot on the fourth ball that over, like, oh, uh-oh.
Yeah.
And then another dot ball was like, oh, uh-oh. And then the run out. And that's it. That's over for him. I guess, look, 2-4-4 in the end, Katty wasn't the biggest chase, but I think almost in a way South Africa would have like picked a chase around that target before the beginning of the game, because it's giving them a useful exercise in doing something they haven't done that successfully at this World Cup. And they still looked a bit shaky, I guess, but a bit more comfortable than they did against Pakistan in that game, and a lot more comfortable than they did against India in that game. It was Andile Pethlequire who eased them home. I guess there's no way for him to play in the semi-final when Marco Jansen comes back, because you end up having to leave out Lungi and Gidi, I guess. But that just is something they miss, isn't it? They don't have that ballast down the order, and you can see why that can be useful from his innings today.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it all tournament, haven't we? That South Africa have basically no all-rounders. So you can see the appeal to keep both Pethlequire and Jansen in when he's back. And you were saying earlier, Ngidi hasn't had the best of tournaments.
No, but he's not been awful. He's taken about a wicket or two every game, which is okay.
Yeah, I guess not being awful isn't the criteria for selection for a World Cup semi-final. But I'm not entirely sure Pethlequire offers substantially more with the ball at the minute than Ngidi, I guess. He bowled pretty well today, but I think when you think about the type of bowlers and the plans that South Africa have gone with so far in the tournament, they'll want Ngidi to be back at his best and Jansen in instead of Pethlequire. So yeah, he offered them more with the bat today, but I don't see any situation where Jansen wouldn't have been able to score those runs to get them home either. But yeah, it's good that they chased it, because I was worried we were going to have to come on here and brand them the worst chasing side in the tournament, which I guess now we don't have to. I'm still not necessarily backing them to win chasing in the semi-final, but we'll have to see.
I think it's that frustration for South Africa, and that the bloke who's iced the chase for them is the person who's not going to play. And like it is that case of like Jansen. It's good for South Africa that Jansen's able to have a rest from a bowling perspective, but actually, this is the exact type of innings and scenario where you want to go in. Like what was it 65 to win at 5 wickets down. It's you're 1 wicket away from kind of a scenario where both teams kind of feel like they've lost, as it were. It's that moment in the balance where people kind of shit themselves, basically. That's when cricket like really gets at its most tense. And I think it was, though, still an overall a kind of beneficial exercise for South Africa, because the first innings just had like massive dead rubber kind of vibes. It got the impression to me of like an inter-club game where no one really wants to be there, and then by the end of it you're like, oh no, we did actually get something out of this. Like, this was a fun experiment. But at the beginning, when kind of Afghanistan weren't showing too much, they kind of fell to 116 for 6. De Kock was just taking catches. I think he took 6 catches behind the stumps or something, and everyone he just celebrated a little bit less. Like, it was quite remarkable how little reaction there was from South Africa. But by the end of it, they will be pleased to have had the kind of monkey off the back. I'd have been interested to know, had they won the toss, whether if they'd have publicly said, oh, we're going to have a chase, because this is our kind of weakest suit, or whether you kind of keep that to yourselves, or if you even want to think about it, whether it's kind of like, oh no, we're fine, we'll be okay. But yeah, win toss, win World Cup for South Africa still for me.
Yeah, I guess it's also nice just that Pethlequaya's had his input into this campaign. He's a likable cricketer. He's specifically quite clutch, I think. I think his numbers probably don't look that great overall, but I would weirdly trust him in this sort of situation. He's just got like a good head on him, I think. Gerald Coetzee, he's fun, isn't he? He fits into a category that Cam likes of looking a bit like a child.
No.
Really old.
You said that he looks like this type of person.
Yeah.
I say that about
another
very famous cricketer.
But it's a category that you have invented.
Oh yeah, I know. I enjoy the category as a whole.
Yeah, but you don't agree that he fits into it?
You really put me on the spot. Gerald, and I think he's a lovely looking boy. I'll let you expand on that.
Okay. No, but I think more, I just like how, I mean, he bowls really well and really quickly, but he just gets properly fired up, doesn't he? I love his headband. I love his celebrations. I love that celebrity appeal he did earlier in the tournament where it wasn't even like some celebrity appeals, you're kind of like appealing towards the slip cordon. Yeah. This wasn't even that. This just was a proper like squat and like yell.
So nothing about his bowling.
Well, and he bowls quickly and he takes middle overs wickets, but that's less interesting, I guess. But he's fun, isn't he, Cam?
Yeah, he's just like a really angry South African robot who's just going to be there and kind of become better and better and win everything forever. I think I didn't realise how dramatic his ascent to the kind of South African team was and has been. I kind of remember seeing his name kind of flying about the traps for whatever in various kind of like franchise competitions. He may have partaken in Major League Cricket, which is a fine tournament that everyone should get behind, especially Washington Freedom. Paid journalism that. But he was out there playing for Texas Super Kings, and I kind of didn't really appreciate that he was there as like a star overseas player, not because like, I don't know, there's this kind of biggest South African affiliation with the tournament, but also because he's literally just a superstar in the making. He's debuted in all 3 formats this year and has kind of risen to a place where, what we were talking about there, you go, right, if a seamer makes way to keep the second all-rounder in the team, does Ngidi go? And you're like, well, no, like Coetzee is entering the competition, is absolutely the third seamer in that side. And for the conversation to be, does Ngidi go rather than does he go, kind of shows the rise of his stock over the last million years of the World Cup.
I think it's interesting, well, he's pretty much there instead of Nortje, right? So having come in the place of their premier quick bowler and risen above maybe a couple of others in the scheme of this tournament, it's been a pretty good tournament for Gerald Coetzee's international career, to be honest. Yeah,
I mean, South Africa's leading wicket taker now, and especially if you look at his split game by game, he's taken at least 3 wickets in 4 separate games and then 2 wickets in 2 others. So that is constant contributions, and that actually can be the role that you end up with figures that look quite ugly, because 2 for 60 can be really good figures in the middle overs and ODI, and yet he's averaging less than 20 with the ball.
He would be. I think it's worth noting though, if South Africa do, for whatever reason, choose to go with 2 spinners in the semi-final, which is a formation they've gone with earlier in the competition, I'd still guess that he'll be the one to make way in the same way he did earlier in the competition. I think it was against Pakistan. They went with 2 spinners and Coetzee sat out, and it was that I'd be shocked if he wasn't the one to make way if a second spinner came into the side.
I guess
that's more to do with the balance of the side though, right? Because you're not going to leave out Pethlequaya for another spinner who can't really bat. So
for sure, but I more mean if Marco Jansen came back in for Pethlequaya and then South Africa went second spinner, then who's the seam who drops out, basically? Yeah. And I'm guessing it'd still be Coetzee.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess it's a bit of a theoretical discussion. But because I do also wonder, because Rabada's not been taking the new ball this World Cup, and he's brilliant whenever he bowls, but Rabada and Jansen with the new ball in the World Cup semi-final, that feels really nice.
Okay, I'm glad you went that way. I thought you were about to start talking about maybe you let Rabada go, and I was like,
absolutely
finished,
not.
Done.
Absolutely not. But I just wonder, especially when Ngidi has that prime role where you should be taking loads of wickets in the way that Jansen has done and Ngidi hasn't quite done. I wouldn't be totally shocked if a guy who's just taken 4 for 44, if that edges him a little bit above someone else in the pecking order. But yeah.
But I think there's a reason why South Africa have gone with the bowling splits they have though, right? So they've thought that the guys they've gone with the new ball have needed the new ball more than perhaps Rabada has needed the new ball. And that's to do with Nortje not being in the squad and also not having Sasanda Magala as their death specialist. And if we look at Coetzee specifically, there were concerns earlier in the tournament against Sri Lanka and against the Netherlands in the middle overs and at the death, that he didn't have, you know, the control that was needed to bowl in those periods, and he didn't have the depth in his skills and his planning at that point to be effective at those times. So if we're talking about Rabada taking the new ball, yeah, it's tempting, you know, like he wouldn't want to see Rabada with a new ball. But if you think about it in terms of South Africa's plans and what's going to work for them through an innings, that's perhaps not the best way to go.
Well, let's talk a bit more about Afghanistan, because I guess this is the end of their World Cup, and I suppose it's a mark of how much they've improved during the tournament, Cam, that these last two games have felt like a bit of a disappointment. Like I know the Australia game was ridiculous for that Maxwell innings, but to push South Africa and Australia quite close a few weeks ago, you've been like, oh, well done, that's great. And now they're looking at like, if we'd won those two games, which we easily could have done, we might be looking at a World Cup semi-final right now.
Well, yeah, we were a Glenn Maxwell miracle away from this being like a really, really tense finish. Obviously, the game plays out in a different way had they won the fixture. But say they'd beaten Australia, and like they did win. Like 21 out of 22 of those players like left and were like, oh, we've done our job today, it's fine. And just like Mujeeb's going to be thinking about that drop catch for a long time, and it's going to be played a lot, unfortunately for him. But it would have been coming to this fixture on 4 wins in a row, and it wasn't. I didn't kind of. I guess the acknowledgement of their improvement comes in. I no longer looked at this as a game where it was like, oh, this will be like a huge upset. Oh, this will be a surprise. It'll still be like a kind of a result at odds with the kind of correlation and trend of international cricket. But they've become, because of how strong their spin attack is, that's a genuine kind of like super strength, to use modern parlance, whatever. And then where their weakness was, they now have another strength in just calm heads in the middle who are kind of knocking off chases. They're like 250, 260, 280. They're just kind of, their median performance has become that much better with the bats that is then increased their strength with the ball. If bowlers are going to have more runs to bowl to defend, they instantly become better, because even without having to send anything down, there's more pressure on the batters. It'll be really interesting to see where it kind of goes from now, if it necessarily translates into a T20 performance next year. There'll be the Champions Trophy in a couple of years' time. Is this like another beginning for a team that's already had many beginnings over the last kind of 2 decades?
Well, that will do for part 1. In part 2, let's talk about Sri Lankan cricket and look ahead quickly to tomorrow's 2 games. So, Sri Lanka cricket have been suspended by the ICC. First, I'll read out the ICC statement, which says, the International Cricket Council, brackets ICC board, has suspended Sri Lanka cricket's membership of the IC with immediate effect. The IC board met today and determined that Sri Lankan cricket is in serious breach of its obligations as a member, in particular, the requirement to manage its affairs autonomously and ensure that there is no government interference in the governance, regulation and/or administration of cricket in Sri Lanka. The conditions of the suspension will be decided by the ICC in due course. Now, there's quite a lot of background to this, which I should try and cover off before we actually discuss it. Estelle Vasudevan alluded to this in the podcast on Monday, so go back and listen to that as well for someone who knows a bit more about what they're talking about. But there's a few things which definitely have happened to influence this. So the Sri Lankan Sports Minister, Roshan Ranasinghe, sacked the Sri Lanka Cricket Board and replaced them with an interim committee. I think this was on Monday or Sunday around then. The interim committee was led by Arjuna Ranatunga. But then seemingly at the same time as this, and it seems like they did it without much knowledge of what each other was doing, Sri Lanka's president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, appointed a 4-man subcommittee to investigate the SLC board. But that's the board that had just been sacked, so it doesn't seem like you need to investigate them. But anyway, that's what happened. The president of SLC, the one who'd just been sacked, Shami Silva, then lodged an appeal with the Supreme Court, who gave a 14-day stay order to the board, which effectively reinstated them for that 2-week period. But then yesterday, there was a resolution passed in Parliament titled Removal of the Corrupt Officials, including Chairman from Sri Lankan Cricket Board, which was then forwarded to the ICC. There's also a bit more background in some really good reporting by Andrew Fidel Fernando on Cricinfo, which says that the ICC still recognises Silva, who's the guy who was kind of sacked, as the president, and it was actually a request from Silva that got the board suspended, basically while it sorts everything out. I think that's kind of covered what is known at the moment. There'll be more to come out. Katya, it's just a bit of a mess, isn't it?
That was a masterclass.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, it's a massive mess, right?
I don't know. There's much more to say than just it is a mess. And don't know. It's also one of those things that I'm expecting in 2 days' time there to be another ridiculous thing that happens in this saga.
Are you allowed to find it funny? I find it quite funny.
I think.
Cause imagine if like Grant Shapps just like Rob Key gone. Like that's kind of like government intervention. I think something that from Andrew Fernando's reporting, which I thought I read that, I was like, okay, I'm kind of going to relax and kind of see this player's course. One, the fact that Estelle and Andrew and people who like follow Sri Lankan cricket closely, this wasn't a surprise for them. I think everyone kind of in the media all gets the ICC press release. It goes into their emails and everyone's like, oh my God, that's a very dramatic email to receive, especially when they normally say like, Sisanda Magala ruled out of like South Africa's 15 for the World Cup.
Yeah,
like,
or Babar within sight of number 1 ranking.
Yeah, exactly. And then you go Sri Lanka like banned. You're like, whoa, okay. But then something that Fernando's also reporting is that it's basically kind of like it's not much of a suspension, but like a warning.
A very, very firm slap on the wrist.
It's basically just like you've got a little bit of time now. Like there's no cricket in the country until December. There's no more ICC funds going to the country until January, and so there's basically this like period of time where it's like sort your stuff out and kind of let's work out the doing. Don't lose by 302 runs, and you can avoid all these things.
Yeah,
it seems a bit trigger happy though. Like a ban surely goes beyond a warning.
But I guess the thing is that actually when you look at in terms of consequences and what they might miss immediately, there's not that much. So in the Future Tours programme, they've got mooted series against Zimbabwe and Afghanistan early next year. This is the men's side, but those haven't been arranged yet. And again, the women's side's next scheduled cricket is in March, I think. The thing that is looks most precarious is that the Under-19 World Cup is set to be held in Sri Lanka next January, and maybe they get it sorted out by January. I think it's probably likely that they will, but can they get it sorted out in time so that all the planning and everything else needs to be done? Is there another place that you can move that? That's the thing that's most up in the air at the moment. But I guess you can kind of be suspended right now because there's nothing to do. So I guess that's how it's a very, very firm, very, very firm warning, I suppose.
Would they not have waited till after the World Cup?
Well, I guess they did wait until one day after they were knocked out officially, though, or at least, which they were not knocked out for that game. But one day after they played their last game, you probably couldn't suspend them before they played their last game, and then they did that, and now they're gone. Yeah. You should talk just a bit more generally because people have wondered about this government interference clause in particular. That is what the ICC have cited, which is there in its constitution, but it's also something that just gets very selectively applied. I mean, to start with, even in the case of Sri Lankan cricket, every release we get that says this squad has been announced or this player has been a replacement comes signed off by the sports minister. Now, presumably that's a rubber stamping kind of thing, but that's still there. I mean, in England, we've had many government hearings over the past few years into the ECB and the issue of racism and inequality in the country, and it's a good thing that those have happened, but you could argue that is government interference of a sort. In Pakistan, you have that the PCB chair is a political appointee, and I guess what I'm trying to get at is that I don't know if government interference in itself is something we need to be definitely be wary of it and think could this lead to something bad? But I don't think it needs to be completely barred, and in effect it's not completely barred, even though the ICC constitution says it is. I mean, cricket is a big deal in lots of places, and it's therefore kind of natural that elected officials, etc., would see fit to get involved at various times. But I suppose this is an example of bad government interference. But you can't just say in a constitution we're against bad government interference, not good government interference. I don't know. It feels like this clause is a bit of a misnomer when what they're actually against is the bad things rather than the government interference itself.
Would you? So I when you said that before we went out, I was like that. I thought it was a very intelligent point, like critical analysis at uni. It's like, you kind of taking the question somewhere else. In my head, I was just being like, oh yes, government interference bad, that should be stopped, and then you kind of walk through it. Do you have necessarily a problem with the ICC kind of eliciting it or bringing it up here and using it, because this has been at the request of the Sri Lankan board? So that's why the kind of idea that the ICC are picking and choosing. Yes, there's obviously their kind of hypocrisies that exist across the world game, obviously notably with Afghanistan at the moment. But if a board come to Sri Lanka, come to the ICC and say, we need your help in this, and then they use that, is that then necessarily a stick to beat the ICC with as an example of being hypocritical when they apply?
Yeah, I guess so. And I guess what you'd hope within the ICC constitution, if there were to be additions or it to be rewritten or whatever, and I'm not saying I have all the answers, but I guess
I want you to have all the answers.
I guess, for example, one thing you could have is that a country's cricket board needed to be elected or appointed in a fair and transparent manner. And if you had that in there, then that would bar this thing that's happened now, but wouldn't bar all government interference, for example. And another thing that we should talk about, because Afghanistan played today and because people have asked about it and because it is just important to talk about, is the fact that in Afghanistan, women are not allowed to play cricket, and that is because of the Taliban, who is in power there at the moment. And I think we would all probably agree that is a reason why the ACB should not be full members of the ICC. But also, the issue isn't, for me, so much that the Taliban are saying that women can't play cricket. The issue is that women can't play cricket. I mean, they're both bad, but if the Taliban were saying it's fine for women to play cricket and the ACB was saying women can't play cricket, I would still say that would be reason enough to bar the ACB, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the stuff with the Afghanistan thing is just how brazenly the rules are being completely flouted. Like yesterday, there was an interview with Jeff Allardyce on the Stumped podcast where he said, it's a board matter. We don't interfere with board matters. And then today, you could argue this is an interference in board matters. The problem with what the ICC have done is they've completely ignored a fundamental part of their own charter, which says if you don't have developmental structures for women, you cannot be a full member. That doesn't mean you can't play cricket, but it does mean you can't play test cricket and you can't be a full member. And they also have not placed the most important voices at the centre of this conversation, which is the women themselves. They haven't responded to a letter that was written to them earlier this year from the Afghanistan players who are now in exile in Australia. And it's quite cold, the way with which they've handled the entire situation of completely divorcing themselves from it. And at the end of the day, cricket's not going to fix the situation for women in Afghanistan. It's not going to improve their day-to-day living conditions in any measurable way. But it's a sign to say, we don't agree with what you're doing, that we're going to abide by our own rules. That's kind of a base mark, right? We're not asking the ICC or they're not asking the ICC to do anything that's going to contradict their own rules. They're asking them to just follow their own rules. And it's also, every time we have this conversation, it's worth remembering what actually happened to those women. When you say that women are banned from playing cricket, it kind of divorces it from the reality of what actually happened, in that these women a lot of them children, teenagers, were chased out of their country by men wielding machine guns and saying they were going to kill them by playing cricket. They were chased over borders in the middle of the night. They spent time in refugee camps in Pakistan for months on end with families and no certainty over their future. And that's what this is about. And then to completely flout your own regulations so brazenly and so in the face of everyone, it just makes a mockery of the ICC, really. And it just shows that they aren't, what they care about isn't what they should care about. What they should care about is integrity of the sport and integrity of their own rules. And realistically, that's not what they're showing people they care about, I guess, with the Afghanistan situation.
What would, because I read your piece again on the way here, and also kind of, so we spoke about it before we recorded. So something that I sometimes wonder is like, I sometimes wonder whether it was more egregious that Afghanistan didn't have a women's team or didn't have a women's structure before the Taliban took over, because that was an ACB decision. It wasn't like it was banned from, like, it's the Taliban, whereas now that's kind of taken out of their hands. So what would integrity look like from an ICC perspective? Would it be a case of not having the men's teams, or like how do they change their charter, or like do they kind of acknowledge that there is this kind of glaring hypocrisy of what the current state of the world is? Because if the men's team were banned now, that would, because there's no women's team, there's not going to be a women's team in Afghanistan until the Taliban are overthrown, and that would be on the news. That would be quite a big event.
Yeah.
Basically.
Well, whether you think the men should be banned or not based on the fact that women can't play cricket is irrelevant. It's in the ICC's charter that you can't be a full member if you don't have women's pathways. So the mistake they've made, if they didn't want to ban the men, and I know for a fact that members of the Afghanistan women's team don't want the men's team to be banned, then they shouldn't have put that in their charter, and they shouldn't have really appointed Afghanistan as a full member when they did appoint them as a full member, because there were some, but very, very limited pathways for women to play cricket in Afghanistan. And from a national team perspective, they weren't able to train to any, before the Taliban took over, they weren't able to train to any standard that a national team should be able to train in. But you can argue the same or similar for other countries around the world with women's cricket. You can look at Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka have an amazing women's team who came over here and beat England over the summer, but they operate in very difficult circumstances within their own country, and pathways and funding and all of this. And if you think about what the potential consequences of this decision could be to ban Sri Lanka, that could have horrific implications on the women's team and the future of women's cricket in Sri Lanka as well. So if you're making a point in your charter that you fundamentally care about women's cricket and want to see it developed into a fully fledged professional game to rival the men's game, your actions don't tell people that that's what you want.
Yeah, and I guess also there was no need. This would have been actually a good chance when Afghanistan got test status. You could have just divorced full membership from test status at that point. And, you know, actually, for example, like Ireland women and Netherlands women played test matches long before they were full members. Netherlands women still aren't full members. Those two things don't need to be joined, and that would be a way to have the Afghanistan men's story have continued without giving the ACB this hugely privileged position within the game in terms of deciding, you know, who gets what money, how tournaments are set up and all that sort of thing. That's not something that the ACB, I suppose, deserve, especially not now, even if the men's team, you know, have deserved to be elevated and lifted up as an inspiring story, I suppose. And that would have been a way to divorce those two things, and they chose not to take it, I guess.
But this is all about power, right? So if you think about government interference, the interference that Sri Lankan board have been under takes away some of the ICC's power over the Sri Lankan Cricket Board or autonomy over cricket in that country. Whereas it's a different situation with the ACB. So you can look at it directly and think where the ICC's influence is threatened in national cricket boards, that's where they're willing to take action. Where when it's not, that's where the action can be bent, or they can afford a lack of action.
Well, we'll be just talking about that a lot more on Katya's doing reporting, speaking to members of or Afghanistan women's cricketers who did have to flee. We've got that ongoing channel open, and next week's pod will have lots more coverage of the Sri Lanka situation and everything we've discussed here. On to much less importantly, really, tomorrow's games. These
Australia,
rubbers,
Bangladesh, try and stop me.
These rubbers are becoming more and more dead by the day, but there is still just about something riding on these. So if Australia beat Bangladesh by enough, I haven't worked it out, I'm sorry, they could take second place in the group, which could be important if that semi-final is rained off against South Africa, because whoever second goes through in that case. And if Pakistan beat England by around 287 runs, they could overtake New Zealand and get to semi-finals. We don't need to make the obvious joke about England here. I think that is unlikely to happen. Pakistan's equation is slightly better than it was last time when they went into the last game of the group stages, also needing a ridiculous result to overtake New Zealand, but not much better. They might go for it. They might not. I guess it just speaks to New Zealand are good at navigating World Cup group stages, aren't they? They in neither of, assume Pakistan do finish fifth, in neither of the last two World Cups will New Zealand have beaten anyone in the top five of the group, and yet they'll have made the semi-finals of both.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really bizarre kind of not just quirk. It's not a quirk. It's built into the structure of the World Cup. But New Zealand are about to play a semi-final, World Cup semi-final, having won one of their last 5 matches. Like, that's a ludicrous scenario. But to kind of dial down that kind of cynicism towards them, they got 400. The Pakistan loss, I know they lost, but I somehow don't feel like Pakistan would have made 400. They also got 300 and a million against Australia. Like, they've played some very, very good cricket throughout the competition, and I do still think they're a chance to kind of knock over India. I think my prediction for tomorrow's games, I think Pakistan are going to win by 288 runs, and then I think that Netherlands are going to knock over India on Sunday, overtaking Bangladesh, qualifying for the Champions Trophy. India, Pakistan semi-final. There we go.
Okay.
Lovely. Well, when the rubbers go dead, the pod still stays alive, and we will be back tomorrow to discuss that Australia game and that England game. So please do join us then. Thank you a lot for listening.